The economy of Egypt was a highly centralized planned economy focused on import substitution under President Gamal Abdel Nasser. In the 1990s, a series of international monetary fund arrangements, coupled with massive external debt relief resulting from Egypt's participation in the Gulf War coalition, helped Egypt improve its macroeconomic performance. Since 2000, the pace of structural reforms, including fiscal, monetary policies, taxation, privatization and new business legislations, helped Egypt move towards a more market-oriented economy and prompted increased foreign investment. The reforms and policies have strengthened macroeconomic annual growth results, which averaged 8% annually between 2004 and 2009, but the government largely failed to equitably share the wealth, and the benefits of growth have failed to trickle down to improve economic conditions for the broader population, especially with the growing problem of unemployment and underemployment. After the 2011 revolution, Egypt's foreign exchange reserves fell from $36 billion in December 2010 to only $16.3 billion in January 2012. Also in February 2012, Standard & Poor's rating agency lowered the Egypt's credit rating from B+ to B in the long term. In 2013, S&P lowered Egypt's long-term credit rating from B to CCC+, and its short-term rating from B to C on worries about the country's ability to meet its financial targets and maintain social peace more than 2 years after President Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in an uprising, ushering in a new era. Macroeconomic trend. Egypt has a stable mixed economy enjoying average growth, averaging 3% to 5% in the past quarter-century. The economy embarked on various stages of development during which the public and private sectors played roles varying in relative importances. Follows. The First Republic, 1952 to 2012, import substitution and nationalization, 1952 to 1966. During which the first program of industrialization in 1957 was established and led by the public sector in heavy industries such as iron and steel, chemical industries, and heavy machinery. Nationalization reduced the relative importance of the private sector. There was no stock trading to speak of, all banks and financial institutions were under the public sector, and foreign direct investment was almost banned. Interwar, 1967 to 1973, adversely affected the performance of the economy and public sector role in import substitution. Openness euphoria, 1974 to 1985, during which policies were introduced to encourage Arab and foreign investment through a series of incentives and liberalizing trade and payment. Heavy emphasis was put on developing the tourism and textile manufacturing industry as drivers of growth. The economy expanded, but this proved unsustainable and growth consequently scaled back. External debt crisis, 1985 to 1990, the external debt crisis and Paris Club rescheduling and debt reduction. Economic reform, 1991 to 2007, reform policies were introduced to meet the terms of international institutions, lenders and donors, including wider incentives to the role of the private sector in all economic activities. The post-global financial crisis, 2008 to 2011, soaring food prices, especially for grains, led to calls for the government to provide more immediate assistance to the population of more than 40% in their poverty tunnel, and to strike a new deal on agriculture policy and reform. Egypt faced the long-term supply and demand side repercussions of the global financial crisis on the national economy. Egypt's gains from annual growth rates benefited the rich and failed to trickle down and reduce the poverty, which increased to about 50% in 2011, leading to socio-economic political instability and popular revolution on the 25th of January 2011. The Second Republic, 2012 present. Egypt needs to strengthen the economy to exogenous shocks, improve productivity, competition, get out of the informality trap, invest in human capital via social protection from a human right-based approach to correct for market failures, and build good trust in governance. The biggest questions for the new president-elect and new government are how to address corruption at the level of the bureaucracy, citizens and parties, how to address the expectations of the Egyptian people, how to bring people from different backgrounds and different voices to support social accountability during economic and political transition to an active developmental state. Egyptian economy is still suffering from a severe downturn following the 2011 revolution, and the government faces numerous challenges as to how to restore growth, market and investor confidence, political and institutional uncertainty, a perception of rising insecurity and sporadic unrest continue to negatively affect economic growth. Reform era. Under comprehensive economic reforms initiated in 1991, Egypt has relaxed many price controls, reduced subsidies, reduced inflation, cut taxes, and partially liberalized trade and investment. Manufacturing had become less dominated by the public sector, especially in heavy industries. A process of public sector reform and privatization has begun to enhance opportunities for the private sector. Agriculture, mainly in private hands, has been largely deregulated, with the exception of cotton and sugar production. Construction, non-financial services, and domestic wholesale and retail trade are largely private. This has promoted a steady increase of GDP and the annual growth rate. The government of Egypt tamed inflation, bringing it down from double-digit to a single-digit. Currently, GDP is rising smartly by 7% per annum due to successful diversification. Gross domestic product per capita based on purchasing power parity increased fourfold between 1981 and 2006, from $1,355 in 1981 to $2,525 in 1991, to $3,686 in 2001, and to an estimated $4,535 in 2006. Based on national currency, GDP per capita at constant 1999 prices increased from 411 Egyptian pounds in 1981, to 2,098 Egyptian pounds in 1991, to 5,493 Egyptian pounds in 2001, and to 8,708 Egyptian pounds in 2006. Based on the current US dollar prices, GDP per capita increased from $587 in 1981, to $869 in 1991, to $1,461 in 2001, and to an estimated $1,518 in 2006. According to the World Bank country classification, Egypt has been promoted from the low-income category to lower-middle-income category. As of 2013, the average weekly salaries in Egypt reached $641, which grew by 20% from the previous year. The reform program is a work in progress. Noteworthy that the reform record has substantially improved since Nazi government came to power. Egypt has made substantial progress in developing its legal, tax and investment infrastructure. Indeed, over the past 5 years, Egypt has passed, amended and admitted over 15 legislative pieces. The economy is expected to grow by about 4% to 6% in 2009-2010. Surging domestic inflationary pressures from both economic growth and elevated international food prices led the Central Bank of Egypt to increase the overnight lending and deposit rates in sequential moves since February 2008. The rates stood at 11.5% and 13.5%, respectively, since the 18th of September 2008. The rise of the world global financial crisis led to a set of fiscal monetary policy measures to face its repercussions on the national economy, including reducing the overnight lending and deposit rates by 1% on the 12th of February 2009. The rates currently stand at 10.5% and 12.5%, respectively. Reform of energy and food subsidies, privatization of the state-owned Bank of Cairo, and inflation targeting are perhaps the most controversial economic issues in 2007, 2008 and 2008-2009. External trade and remittances. Egypt's trade balance marked $10.36 billion in FY 2005 compared to $7.5 billion. Egypt's main exports consist of natural gas, and non-petroleum products such as ready-made clothes, cotton textiles, medical and petrochemical products, citrus fruits, rice and dried onion, and more recently cement, steel, and ceramics. Egypt's main imports consist of pharmaceuticals and non-petroleum products such as wheat, maize, cars and car spare parts. The current account grew from 0.7% of GDP in FY 2002 to 3.3% at FY 2005. Egypt's current account made a surplus of $4,478 million in FY 2005 compared to a deficit of $158 million in FY 2004. Italy and the USA are the top export markets for Egyptian goods and services. In the Arab world, Egypt has the largest non-oil GDP as of 2005. According to the International Organization for Migration, an estimated 2.7 million Egyptians abroad contribute actively to the development of their country through remittance inflows, circulation of human and social capital, as well as investment. In 2009, Egypt was the biggest recipient of remittances in the Middle East. An estimated $7.8 billion was received in 2009, representing approximately 5% of national GDP, with a decline of 10% from 2008, due mostly to the effect of the financial crisis. According to data from Egypt's central bank, the United States was the top sending country of remittances, followed by Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Public finances. On the revenue side, total revenues of the government were 89.1 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2002 and are projected to reach 184.7 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2008. Much of the increase came from a rise in customs, excise and tax revenues, particularly personal income and sales, entertainment, and vice taxes, which constituted the bulk of total domestic taxes, due to recent tax reforms. This trend is likely to gradually widen the tax base in the forthcoming years. Revenues, however, have remained more or less constant as a percentage of the GDP over the past few years. On the expenditures side, strong expenditure growth has remained a main feature of the budget. This is mainly a result of continued strong expansion of the public sector wages driven by government pledges. Wages and compensations increased from 30.5 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2002 to 59.6 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2008. High interest payments on the public debt stock. Interest payments rose from 21.8 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2002 to 52 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2008. Importantly, dramatic increase in domestic debt, which is projected to be roughly 62% of GDP in FY 2008, up from 58.4% in FY 2002, and the cost of food and energy subsidies, which rose from 18 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2002 to 64.5 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2008. The overall deficit, after adjusting for net acquisition of financial assets, remains almost unchanged from the cash deficit. The budget's overall deficit of 43.8 billion Egyptian pounds or minus 10.2% of GDP for FY 2002 has become 49.2 billion in FY 2007, so that is narrowed to minus 6.7% of GDP. Deficit is financed largely by domestic borrowing and revenue from divestment sales, which became a standard accounting practice in Budget Egypt. The government aims at more sales of state assets in FY 2008. Recently, the fiscal conclave of the government was under strong criticism and heated debate and discussions in the Egyptian parliament. In particular, a reference was made to weak governance and management, loose implementation of tax collection procedures and penalties for offenders, and improper accounting of the overall system of basic subsidies and domestic debt, leading to domestic market disruptions, high inflation, increased inefficiencies and waste in the domestic economy. Treasury bonds and notes issued to the Central Bank of Egypt constitute the bulk of the government domestic debt. Since FY 2001, net government domestic debt has been rising at a fluctuating but increasing rate. In 2014, it reached 77%, up from 54.3% of GDP in 2001. Opportunity cost of conflict. A report by Strategic Foresight Group has calculated the opportunity cost of conflict for Egypt since 1991 is almost $800 billion. In other words, had there been peace since 1991, an average Egyptian citizen would be earning over $3,000 instead of $1,700 he or she may earn next year. The financial sector. The Central Bank of Egypt is the national reserve bank and controls and regulates the financial market and the Egyptian pound. There is a state regulatory authority for the Cairo Stock Exchange. State-owned or nationalized banks still account for 85% of bank accounts in Egypt and around 60% of the total savings. The penetration of banking is low in rural areas at only 57% of households. Monetary policy. Up until 2007, there has been several favorable conditions that allowed the Central Bank of Egypt to accumulate net international reserves, which increased from $20 billion in FY 2005 to $23 billion in FY 2006, and to $30 billion FY 2007, contributing to growth in both reserve money and in broad money. This has declined to $16.4 billion in October 2015, according to the Central Bank of Egypt. Credit extended to the private sector in Egypt declined significantly, reaching about 5 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 2005. This credit crunch is due to the non-performing loans extended by the banks to business tycoons and top government officials. Lending criteria have been tightened following the passing of Money Laundering Law 80 in 2002 and Banking Law 88 in 2003. Interest rates are no longer the dominant factor in banks' lending decisions. In fact, both the inefficiency and absence of the role of the Central Bank of Egypt in qualitative and quantitative control as well as implementing banking procedures and standards was almost entirely responsible for the non-performing loans crisis. Banks steadily reduced credit from its peak of about 30 billion Egyptian pounds in FY 1999 and alternatively invested in more liquid, no-risk securities such as Treasury bills and government bonds. Improving private sector access to credit will critically depend on resolving the problem of non-performing loans with businesses and top government officials. The era of inflation targeting, i.e., maintaining inflation within a band, has perhaps begun in Egypt more recently. Country experiences show that inflation targeting is a best practice strategy for monetary policy. While the monetary policy appears more responsive to inflationary pressures recently in Egypt, it is noted that there is no core inflation measure and the Central Bank of Egypt takes targeting decisions based on the inflation rate released by the CAPMAS Consumer Price Index off the shelf. Surging domestic inflationary pressures from both economic growth and elevated international food prices led the Central Bank of Egypt to increase the overnight lending and deposit rates in sequential moves since 2008. It was raised by 0.25% on the 10th of February 2008, by 0.5% on the 25th of March 2008, by 0.5% on the 8th of May 2008, by 0.5% on the 26th of June 2008. By 0.5% on the 7th of August 2008 and most recently on the 18th of September 2008 for the sixth time in a year by 0.5% when it stood at 11.5% and 13.5%, respectively. The rise of the world global financial crisis led to a set of fiscal monetary policy measures to face its repercussions on the national economy, including reducing the overnight lending and deposit rates by 1% on the 12th of February 2009. The rates currently stand at 10.5% and 12.5%, respectively. The CBE is expected to further cut on interest rates over 2009, with seemingly little fear on Egyptian pound depreciation resulting from decreased interest rates. Exchange rate policy. The exchange rate has been linked to the US dollar since the 1950s. Several regimes were adopted, including initially the conventional peg in the 60s, regular crawling peg in the 70s and the 80s, and crawling bands in the 90s. Over that time period, there were several exchange rate markets, including black market, parallel market and the official market. With the turn of the new millennium, Egypt introduced a managed float regime and successfully unified the pound exchange rate vis-a-vis foreign currencies. The transition to the unified exchange rate regime was completed in December 2004. Shortly later, Egypt has notified the International Monetary Fund that it has accepted the obligations of Article 8, Section 2, 3, and 4 of the IMF Articles of Agreement, with effect from the 2nd of January 2005. IMF members accepting the obligations of Article 8 undertake to refrain from imposing restrictions on the making of payments and transfers for current international transactions, or from engaging in discriminatory currency arrangements or multiple currency practices, except with IMF approval. By accepting the obligations of Article 8, Egypt gives assurance to the international community that it will pursue economic policies that will not impose restrictions on the making of payments and transfers for current international transactions unnecessary, and will contribute to a multilateral payments system free of restrictions. In the fiscal year 2004 and over most of the fiscal year 2005, the pound appreciated against the US dollar. Since the second half of the fiscal year 2006 until the end of the fiscal year 2007, the pound gradually appreciated to 5 Egyptian pounds and 69 piastres per USD. While it was likely to continue appreciating in the short term, given the skyrocketing oil prices and the weakening U.S. economy, the advent of the global economic crisis of 2008, and resulting behavior of foreign investors exiting from the stock market in Egypt increased the dollar exchange rate against the Egyptian pound, which rose by more than 4% since Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. As the demand pressure from exiting foreign investors eases, the dollar exchange rate against the Egyptian pound is expected to decline. It stands at 7 Egyptian pounds per USD as of the 18th of June 2013.